Hello everyone, and welcome back. I haven't posted in a while because I was working on this next set of videos, which will be about Isaiah's teachings in the Book of Mormon. For the longest time, I thought that Isaiah's writings were mystical or symbolic raving, and I had no idea what he was talking about. However, I found that having context and background really helps make his writings less confusing. And that's going to be my goal here, to provide you with enough historical and cultural context for the chapters to make sense. Not just to tell you what he's talking about, but to give you enough background so that you'll understand his writings better and maybe even enjoy reading them. Although Isaiah is quoted extensively in the Book of Mormon, the first chapters that are taken from Isaiah in their entirety are 1 Nephi 20 and 21, where Nephi is reading from the brass plates to his brothers after they've arrived in the New World. And Nephi explains to his audience why he's chosen to teach his brothers from Isaiah in 1 Nephi 19:23, where he says, "And I did read many things unto them which were written in the books of Moses, but that I might more fully persuade them to believe in the Lord their Redeemer, I did read unto them that which was written by the prophet Isaiah. For I did liken all scriptures unto us, that it might be for our profit and learning." We'll keep coming back to this. Nephi's reasoning for teaching Isaiah to his brothers was to persuade them to believe in the Savior. And I'll ask, is that what you get out of reading Isaiah? Until recently, that was not my experience. Now, going back to Nephi and his brothers, it was understood that Isaiah's writings applied to or were talking about the house of Israel. But Lehi's family no longer lived in Israel. So Nephi explained that even though they were now separated from Israel by a vast ocean, Isaiah's writings still apply to them. Here's verse 24. "Hear ye the words of the prophet, ye who are a remnant of the house of Israel, a branch who have been broken off. Hear ye the words of the prophet, which were written unto all the house of Israel, and liken them unto yourselves, that ye may have hope, as well as your brethren from whom ye have been broken off. For after this manner has the prophet written." And I had never really thought about that before, that Nephi's brothers might think that now that they no longer lived anywhere near Jerusalem, that they might not be God's covenant people anymore. But here Nephi explains that they're still God's covenant people. They're a separate branch now, but they're still part of the overall family. We might further add that joining the Church of Jesus Christ makes you an adopted member of the house of Israel, which would mean his words would apply to you as well. Now, to understand 1 Nephi 20, which is Isaiah 48 in the Old Testament, it helps to understand the specific setting. Although Isaiah taught very roughly from 750 to 700 BC, the group he is addressing lived around 540 BC. His message is specifically to the Jews who were carried away to Babylon after Jerusalem was destroyed. And his message is so specifically addressed to them, to people who lived roughly 200 years after he did, that many scholars believe that Isaiah didn't write those chapters because how could he have? How could someone living before 700 BC write a specific message for people living in 540 BC? But nonetheless, that's his target audience, Jews who had been carried away captive to Babylon. And we'll discuss the circumstances of those people in just a minute. Another thing that it's important to understand as you read Isaiah is that in Old Testament times, people worshipped a lot of different gods. The Philistines had their gods. The Moabites had their gods. Babylon had a whole pantheon of gods. The Hebrews were monotheistic and believed in only one God. Everyone had a different system of gods that they believed in. And when these ancient nations and tribes fought with each other, they didn't view wars simply as armies competing one with another, but rather as whole religious systems competing with each other. And they assumed the side with the stronger gods was going to win the battles. And you see these competitions of my God is better than your God at play all throughout the Old Testament. Think about Elijah's competition with the priest of Baal. Or think of David versus Goliath in 1 Samuel 17. You have David and Goliath moving toward each other on the battlefield. Goliath cursed David by his Philistine gods, and then David responded, quote, "Thou comest to me with a sword and with a spear and with a shield, but I come to thee in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom thou hast defied." David wasn't on the battlefield to prove that he was stronger than Goliath. He was proving that the Israelite God was stronger than the Philistine God. So, just a quick side note, when Lehi and other prophets testified that Jerusalem would be destroyed, some people would have considered that blasphemy, because how could you possibly imply that God's people would lose? Because that would mean that their God was going to lose. But then Jerusalem did lose. King Nebuchadnezzar conquered Jerusalem and carried its people away captive to Babylon. The city itself was destroyed so completely that not a single stone of the temple remained on top of another. So what did that mean religiously? In Old Testament thinking, it meant that the God of Israel had been defeated. And generally, when your God was defeated, you started believing in the gods of the people who had conquered you. So in the years and decades after Jerusalem was destroyed, many of God's chosen people started worshiping other gods. But then something completely unexpected happened. In 539 BC, after the people of Israel had been living in Babylon for almost 50 years, Cyrus the Great, the leader of Persia, conquered Babylon. And if you were ever going to pick someone to be conquered by, Cyrus would be the one. He was not like the other conquerors of his day. For example, after Cyrus conquered Babylon, he not only allowed the Jews to leave Babylon and return to Jerusalem, he also fully funded the reconstruction of their temple. And Cyrus wasn't even one of God's chosen people. He was a Gentile. And Isaiah prophesied specifically about Cyrus. In Isaiah chapter 44, which is a couple of chapters before the chapter that we're reading here that Nephi is quoting, Isaiah 44:28 mentions Cyrus by name and talks about him rebuilding the temple. And chapter 45 begins with Isaiah talking about Cyrus being the Lord's anointed one. And remember, Isaiah wrote all of this more than 100 years before Cyrus was even born. And that's why many scholars think Isaiah couldn't have written the chapters toward the end of the book of Isaiah, because they're too specific. They mention Cyrus by name. But the fact that these writings were in the brass plates, which were taken from Jerusalem in 600 BC, kind of settles that argument. Okay, with all of that as backdrop, we now get to today's material. 1 Nephi 20, or Isaiah 48, was a message directed to God's covenant people who were living in Babylon at the time when Cyrus was about to deliver them. God was disappointed in his people. They were his covenant people, and he expected them to be loyal to him. But in the 50 years since they were conquered, their faith in God had waned, and many of them had turned to other gods. Beginning with 1 Nephi chapter 20, verse 1, he addresses them as his covenant people. He says that his people are still baptized and still talk about God, but they don't do so righteously. And I should point out that mentioning baptism is unique to the Book of Mormon's version of this chapter. It's not in modern translations of the Bible. In verse 2, the Jews, he says, still talk about Jerusalem as their holy city, but they no longer depend on their God. God will spend the next several verses making a two-part argument to prove that he is still the one in charge. First, he points to his track record on the former things, such as the destruction of Jerusalem and his people being carried into captivity. He says that he prophesied about these events in advance so that his people couldn't give their idols credit for them happening. In verse 3, he says, "Behold, I have declared the former things from the beginning, and they went forth out of my mouth, and I showed them. I did show them suddenly." He describes the people as stubborn, having an iron neck, and also as shameless, having a brass brow, which means an expressionless face. Verse 5, "And I showed them," or in other words, I prophesied these things that I'm talking about, "for fear lest thou should say, Mine idol hath done them, and my graven image, and my molten image hath commanded them." In other words, God prophesied in advance that his people would be conquered and taken captive because He wanted to make sure that his people gave him credit for it happening rather than giving credit to the idols of the people who conquered them. Then in verse 6, he says, now that you've seen and heard all this, will you not declare it? Meaning, will you not give me credit for my prophecies being fulfilled? And then also in verse 6, he says, now that you've seen I was right about the past, I'm going to show you some new things. And here, where he's talking about new things or prophecies that haven't happened yet, he's referring to the prophecy that they would be delivered by the Gentile king Cyrus, who he named a couple of chapters earlier in Isaiah. So now, after he has established his credibility in these first few verses, he pivots to a different topic. His people have abandoned him, and they've been disobedient. So how is he going to handle that? On one hand, the people deserve his anger. And since they've abandoned him, they probably deserve to remain in captivity. But he says in verse 9, for my name's sake, I will defer mine anger and avoid cutting them off. Remember, we're in that era where religious systems were competing with each other, and God has a reputation to worry about. So he's going to rescue them because he doesn't want people saying that the Hebrew God is too weak to rescue his own people. In verse 10, he briefly explains his motive for allowing his people to be taken captive. He wanted them to be refined in the furnace of affliction. He's basically saying, the Babylonians didn't conquer you because your God was weak. It was all part of my divine plan. Then verse 11, he says, for mine own sake, yea, for mine own sake will I do this. I will not suffer my name to be polluted, and I will not give my glory unto another. In other words, he's saying, you're not being rescued because of anything you've done, but because I'm going to show my power. And as a modern reader, perhaps one whose faithfulness ebbs and flows, despite having made a covenant with God, this same notion might apply to you, where he will save you for the covenant's sake, not because your actions have earned you salvation. You're one of his people, he will save you. Continuing, he says that he is the first and the last, meaning, in this context, that I was here before the first idol was made, and I'll be here long after the last idol is gone. In other words, I'm not just the best God, I'm the only God. I'm a permanent God. Verse 13, mine hand hath also laid the foundation of the earth, and my right hand hath spanned the heavens. I call unto them, and they stand up together. In plain English, he says, I created the heavens and the earth, and when I call them, they stand up and they respond. Verse 14 is a little chest thumping. Which of all your idols prophesied that Cyrus would rescue you? The Lord has loved Cyrus, and he will conquer the Babylonians and the Chaldeans. Verse 15, Cyrus is my instrument. I summoned him, and he shall prosper. In the Book of Mormon, we don't get the Cyrus context because Nephi didn't include the previous couple of chapters that have Isaiah's sermons that name Cyrus specifically. Continuing, referring to the prophecies about Cyrus, he says in verse 16, and this wasn't a secret. The Lord sent me long ago, and you've had this prophecy all along. Verse 17, thus saith the Lord thy Redeemer, I have sent him. Again, that's Cyrus. Who did all of this? It was me, the Lord your God, the one who teaches you how to prophet and tells you how to safely navigate. If only you'd listened to me, things would have been as peaceful as a river, and your posterity would have been as numerous as the sand of a river. So now go, leave Babylon, singing that the Lord has delivered his people, and sing about how they crossed the desert and thirsted not, because he caused water for them to spring forth from the rocks. But notwithstanding everything he has done and can do, there is no peace for the wicked. So the chapter in a nutshell, God has a history of making accurate prophecies, and he makes these prophecies so that no one else can take credit for his work, or so that no one else can take credit for the events as they unfold. And now, he's prophesying that Cyrus, the Gentile, will miraculously free them from Babylon and send them home. He also says in the chapter that God's people have gone astray and don't deserve to be rescued, but they are his people, and he won't let anyone think that their God is too weak to save his own people. And if only they'll remember him always, they would always prosper. And that's how the chapter ends. And I think we'll find that this is typical with many of the Isaiah chapters, where it takes longer to explain the context than it does to simply just read the chapter. Next time we'll cover 1 Nephi 21, which is basically Isaiah 49. And we will see you next time.